So my remit is to talk for about 30 minutes, and I understand there's a Q&A session, which I look forward to, and you probably will find more interesting than the talk. But looking at the agenda for the rest of this meeting, I'm really excited to be here. It's great to see how this partnership is thriving, and some of the things that were just envisioned as a possibility a few years ago look like they're actually happening, which is very exciting. So what I want to do is sort of give you a perspective from across what we're seeing at the FDA, and then for the rest of the day you can fit in the things that you're looking at into this picture, or you might disagree with the way I see it, which always makes it more interesting. So we are in this era now of precision medicine, and it has been amazing to work with a president who really understands this. And I've said this before, but when you're in a room with the president, he can carry on a discussion about genetics, genomics. He does math, which, no offense to any lawyers in the room, but often lawyers are not thinking mathematically or quantitatively. He's very good at it. And it's given us some interesting direction. But it's also important to recognize political appointees are on a time clock now, 18 weeks to go. And precision medicine is not something that's just a presidential initiative. It's really a way of thinking and a way of doing work, which I have seen is pervasive throughout the FDA. And what's building this is a combination of things all happening at the same time. This is not news to any of you in the room because many of you have been working on it. Patients and their representatives have a much larger role to play that's now recognized in medical product development and assessment. A lot of interesting dialogue in the press the last couple of days because of a tough decision we had to make related to a rare disease this week. Electronic health records. It just seems obvious now that everyone has an electronic health record, but just think 10 years ago, almost no one had one, really. Now every American has an electronic health record. As flawed as they are, they do exist, and it creates an opportunity that we need to take advantage of. And of course, the technologies we're now seeing definitely didn't exist a few years ago. Had dinner last night with Sean Parker, which was fascinating to hear the view of someone who was there at the beginning of Facebook and then Napster, and he's got all kind of new things going on, including becoming one of the world's biggest philanthropists now for cancer research, which is why a group of us got together for dinner. But going from a time when you dealt with representatives of people to communicating directly with people over their personal devices, when their personal devices are measuring so many things about them, is really amazing. And then, of course, genomics. And I'll say a little bit more about where this looks like it's headed, but it's, we've sort of gone through the era of fascination with knowing that there's a genome and what's in it. Then we've been measuring the products of the genome, and technologies are being developed to take advantage of that, both diagnostic and therapeutic. But we're now entering the era of gene editing, and I'll just talk a little bit about that because I think it's something that's happening so fast that none of us know exactly what to do with it. And then, of course, data science is at the core of this. It's all about information. To me, the most important thing to realize about the role of the FDA, and I would argue also for payers in the future, and as much as possible now, is that when we have good data, we still have arguments about the right decisions to make, but they're qualitatively very different than when we have lousy data. And unfortunately, we have to make a lot of decisions with lousy data right now. So I'm really hopeful that this partnership will be a stimulus to improve the kinds of information that we have so that we can work together on a rational system of product development, evaluation, and use. So while precision medicine is a way of thinking, it also is a presidential initiative, and it's going to be kind of fun to see what happens over the next 4 months as the Precision Medicine Initiative rolls out to the public after a lot of work that's been done across the federal agencies led by the NIH. I think the most important concept for people to understand who are not into the details here is that there's a reason it's called precision medicine and not personalized medicine. And that reason, at least in my opinion, is that there was a misconception that personalized medicine meant that you could study a tiny little group of people and learn enough from that you could extrapolate it to the whole world. And so product development would become an enterprise where you just studied a few people because you could measure things so precisely. In fact, it's exactly the opposite. It's called precision medicine because the way you know what to do with an individual or how to involve an individual is to look across a broad population at what individuals have in common, and then look at how they respond to treatment or how measurements relate to their diagnosis and prognosis, and then apply that based on the preferences of the individual. But the key to precision medicine is having larger populations, not smaller populations. And this is something that almost everyone has agreed to now, and it's been fun in the cancer moonshot with the vice president who's driven to move cancer more quickly, as I've had the chance to meet with the world's experts repeatedly. It's interesting when the vice president says, "Come to my house," people tend to show up. I haven't noticed a lot of people turning down the invitation. And what's really evolved is a view that in the ideal world, people with cancer would be enrolled in a clinical trial at the time of diagnosis, and they would essentially be in a clinical trial for the rest of their lives, because what we're seeing is that precision cancer therapy involves cures in some cases, but in many cases turning cancer to a chronic disease. And it's a battle against an enemy that morphs based on the treatment that's given, which means you have to keep changing the treatment in iterative, factorial ways. And you can't understand how all these things fit together without participation in something that looks like a clinical trial. So I'd urge you shortly when the call comes out to sign up. What's going to happen is there are a set of health systems and federally qualified health centers that have been selected to be enrollment centers, but there's also going to be a call for any American who wants to sign up to donate your data and your biospecimens for the good of science and medicine to do so. Amazingly enough, there's a mechanism called Sync for Science under the clarity that your electronic health record actually does belong to you, not to your doctor and not to the health system who your doctor works for, that you can tell your health system, please upload my data to the Precision Medicine Initiative, and the 7 big electronic health record companies have agreed to do that and have been working on a technical solution to that problem. Now, that doesn't automatically curate all your data. Many of you know there's going to be a lot of work to get to where we need to be with that. But personally, I think it's going to be really important for knowledgeable leaders who understand technology to volunteer, because that'll stimulate other Americans. And it's being positioned as 1 million or more. And my view is to do what we need to do, we need something on the order of tens of millions, more like 10 to 100 million. And we know from surveys of Americans that about 70% would like their information to be used to help their families and other people with the future of their health care. And so there's a willingness and interest in doing this, but we need examples of volunteers. So I'll be asking all of you when the call comes out, have you signed up? And I hope you will do so. There's another aspect of this which the more I look at it, the more exciting it gets. And this has an important element of diagnostic devices built into it. If you think about it, as a clinical investigator, I was always limited by the fact that people had to come back to a clinic, and then a limited number of things could be measured because you had to collect the information on a case report form, and storage capacity was very limited. Now we're all wearing devices, and the time element now becomes something that can be continuous for a lot of aspects that we need to measure. It's a whole different world. And I think an easy way to just keep in your mind the importance of time. I've been to 4 Rolling Stones concerts once a decade for the last 4 decades. Mick has not gotten prettier, I would say, during that time. But the fascinating thing is if you look at his body when he's performing, it pretty much like it was 40 years ago. He goes for a solid 2.5 hours of constant calisthenics that are hard for me to even imagine at my age. So this time dimension is something that we've been unable to really take into account the way we should, but we now have the technical capacity to do it thanks to the gadgets that have been developed, and we've got to figure out now how to deal with these data. And then we have diagnostic testing, and this just a simple demonstration for something you all know. As we go from one test at a time to next generation sequencing, 3 billion base pairs all at one time, we've got to change the way we think about regulation, but the ecosystem has to change the way it thinks about its behavior. Because when you think about 3 billion base pairs, we've been focused on if we regulate one test at a time, it'll be 50 years before we even get through a tenth of polymorphisms that need to be evaluated. But I want to throw it back at the clinical ecosystem and say if each little academic medical center and each little company tries to aggregate its own population and figure out what each polymorphism means, it'll be more than 50 years before this is done. And so we've been working with the NIH and others to create the concept of a data commons where if you're developing next generation sequencing, first of all, to get the informatics right, we're having contests where people compete to see if they can figure out what the genetic sequence is that we're putting out there. And in the context of that, they learn from each other using the tools that are available on the network that they couldn't otherwise have access to easily. But in addition to that, the future of this, I think, very importantly, will be through things like precision medicine, having population data available so that when you do look at your polymorphisms, rather than having to go out and spend the enormous amount of money and time it would take to amass 10,000 people to do a longitudinal study to figure out the clinical validity of the test, this will be available because led by groups like the Cystic Fibrosis Foundation, I think what patients are beginning to realize is that it's not in their interest to have companies struggling to figure out how to make the diagnoses that are important to them. And increasingly, I think we're going to see volunteerism making data available as part of it. Now the secretive clinical development world has got to wake up and change the way it does business. We're ready on the regulatory side. I just wish you guys would pick up the speed here because the country really needs it. And if you didn't think that we need to change the way we're thinking about things, I just want to mention gene editing. A lot of people are talking about it now, and so it's not something I thought of, obviously, but you know, as we go from, we know the base pairs to the thought of, could you actually go in and clip out a gene you didn't like, insert a gene that you did like? 5 years ago, I think all of us would have said, well, there's some clunky stuff and it's not really going to work. But now we have at least one technology and probably two or three that look like they actually work. And so I had these amazing briefings the last couple of weeks, plants, animals, and people. So you think about this, if you have a gene that, let's just take plants, that may be responsible for producing nutrient proteins that are important, it's going to be entirely feasible to insert that gene into the plant genome. And in fact, what totally got me, I won't say sleepless, but concerned and excited at the same time was if you go to high school science fairs now, for $300, high school students can buy kits that enable them to do gene editing in plants. $300 high school students. So the rest of us had better get with it and figure out what we want to do with this technology. But, you know, if you think about world hunger, 1 billion people every day going hungry, much of it in countries where farm-to-table perishing of foods is a huge issue, and we begin to understand plant genetics more and more. What used to take a decade of radiating seeds, which was the way it was done, and then breeding the plants, it's really genetic manipulation, but we don't, it's not called GMO, so the public has accepted it. Now can be done in a matter of a few months. This could be dramatically good. It could be dramatically bad if it's misused and not appropriately dealt with. But what if you wanted animal models of human disease? We're beginning to see this now, inserting human genes into animals that recapitulate the disease much closer than the many failed animal models that we've had in the past. And of course, if you had one of the 5,000 rare genetic diseases that has no treatment right now, you'd be very interested in the possibility that the cause could be determined through next generation sequencing, and changes in your genome could be directly inserted that would maybe alleviate the need for a short life or a longer life with a chronic disease that's very hard to treat. Really, really exciting, but a new and different world that we need to work together to be prepared for. So what about the system the way it works now? This has sort of been my mantra slide for 15 years, and it's really exciting to see that the technology's here now. It's only the human beings who are in the way. We've got to figure out how to take advantage of the technology that we have. It's entirely possible that all these ideas that people have from the sciences could be tested in clinical trials very rapidly. We could determine what works and then deploy what works in a very systematic way. And I think a lot of what you're going to talk about the rest of the day is how to do this in the area of devices, and I'm very excited about it. And the world of a clinician would go from a situation where you're spending all your time right now just trying to get data in a computer to a situation where you're getting real decision support back that helps you figure out what to do more quickly and spend more time with the patient, which I think is an aspiration that we all have as patients. But just a quick word about the history, because it's been fascinating to me that as the technology is getting better, there's a cartoon that I love that says technology advances, people never change. And we continue to see people going back to believing that somehow doctors can figure out what works and what doesn't through their own personal experience. And there's a key role for doctors and other healthcare professionals in this, and for patients, but we shouldn't have to relive the history that we've had, and I've been immersed in this lately because of other things going on. With drugs prior to 1962, you didn't have to show that a drug was effective to get it on the market. Thalidomide came along, and Congress very wisely said, it's not enough to show a drug safe, you should show it's effective before putting it on the market. And one part of the story that hasn't been talked about enough is that while Francis Kelsey blocked the wide-scale use of thalidomide in the U.S., the company very cleverly duped 1,200 doctors into believing they could figure out if it worked by doing their individual clinical trials through sampling in the United States. And you know this is not a good thing for children in the United States, many of whom were born with serious birth defects. And of course these doctors couldn't figure it out. It really took organized studies and data to figure it out. So the FDA was given a lot of power, and I wonder if these people hadn't been so smart in 1962, how long it would have taken to figure out that to really know the risks and benefits of a treatment, you got to measure the risks and benefits. It's really that simple, in my opinion, and I know that's a lot of what you're all going to talk about today. So this legislation, though, created the modern clinical trials industry, which I believe has become outdated. It's something that a lot of people have become comfortable with, but it's generally based on what I call the parallel universe. It's creating separate data sets at a very high cost that produce nice-looking data tables that people can feel comfortable with, but because it's so expensive, don't answer the majority of questions that people need to have answered in order to know how to use products effectively. So I think the system has really served society well, but it's time for a change, and that's, as I know in the next session, what you all are going to be talking about quite a bit. Well, why do I say the system's flawed? And I was just talking with Rachel Florence, who's doing a lot of work with PCORNet, which is PCORI's effort to put together a national network to do observational studies and pragmatic clinical trials, and and with the NIH, as I'll mention more in a minute. We're seeing that we can do trials a lot less expensively by using data that already exists, but we have a lot of work to do to curate the data and get it clean. And what's happened in the system that we have is that clinicians and administrators, by and large, are not excited about participating because it's hard for them to see the relevance to their practice. It's seen as something that interferes with practice, and unless we fix that problem, we're going to have a lot of difficulty getting the information that we really need. I'll continue to show this slide till someone beats it, but right now cardiology is king of evidence-based medicine, with the amazing statistic of 15% of important decisions being supported by high-quality evidence. Everybody else is worse than that. So the competition's open for any other field that can do better. So while we are getting the data we need in this parallel universe clinical trials world to make initial decisions about what can come on the market, the whole lifespan of the products, their performance, and how they fit in with other therapies is the knowledge is not accruing at the rate that we need it to. And somewhat frighteningly, if we look at the consumer price index of the country relative to the consumer price index of traditional clinical trials, we're in a situation that's not acceptable. We're seeing hyperinflation in the cost of traditional clinical trials. So we should be highly motivated to develop a new system that takes advantage of all this technology to answer questions that are relevant to both manufacturers of products, but more importantly to the patients and clinicians who depend on good information. So as I said before, our goal would be to solve the problems the FDA needs solved, but also contribute to the bigger ecosystem where I think we'd all love to see a world where clinical expertise was combined with the best research evidence, and there was time to talk with patients about what they preferred and to put that information together into better decision-making that would be more helpful to the people that we serve. I'm going to move in the interest of time. And that system would obviously take advantage of what's happening in practice as opposed to trying to do studies separately from practice, and would make use of the data that's already being collected, which I know, again, is what you're working on. Now, how do we know this can work? Well, the Sentinel system now, really developed for the FDA as a whole, but oriented towards the drug side at this point, has about 200 million Americans in it now, and it's being used every day to look at issues of drug safety. It's a complicated system of a distributed network where people hang on to their data and then answer questions using a common data model, and there are other models that are evolving, but it's definitely one that works and one that we're going to make available more publicly as a national resource over the next several years. Let's see, we got one slide that I didn't change. And then just a shout out to PCORNet. This is something I was working with before coming to FDA, so I'll admit that I'm biased towards seeing this work. But the idea behind PCORNet is that you combine networks that are driven by the patients themselves with networks that consist of integrated health systems and their electronic health records, that one can have a national infrastructure for research centered on the patient. There's a lot of different kinds of data that need to be put together and curated, and this is just a look at all those different kinds of data, which they've been working on, and I'm told now that it's really beginning to come together. So one of my things that I was sort of shocked by when we first tried to do it was, if you take electronic health record systems in the U.S. and just try to construct table one like you would have in any paper you would write or any submission you would send to the FDA, it was amazing that we couldn't identify the sex, race of the populations that were enrolled. It just wasn't collected in a way that was reliable. But a lot of work has gone on now, and as you can see, in PCORNet, 120 million Americans are now in this system, and I think it's really actually 145 million when you add it up. So it's really ready to take off. And then finally, another project I was involved with, which is really working, is the NIH Healthcare Systems Collaboratory. 10 practical clinical trials, each being done at about 10% of the cost of a traditional clinical trial. And these are working. None of the results are in yet, but the enrollment has gone well, and they will answer the questions. So then finally, putting this together across the federal system, like you, I would guess like you, I actually had not read the entire ACA, and I probably never will. But in a meeting last year, I learned that we were actually instructed by Congress to work across the federal agencies to put together a consortium that would create an infrastructure for a national data system. And indeed, when you look at each federal agency, what's been going on is every single one of them has a major, massive project oriented towards taking advantage of electronic data already being captured and making it available for learning. I prefer now to call it learning instead of research because it includes everything from quality systems all the way through randomized clinical trials. And what was not happening as well as it could have, though, is interdigitating across these systems, because some of them were built on registries, some built on prospective collection of data for science, like the Million Veteran Study, some of them like Sentinel built on claims data, others built on electronic health record data. So we put together thoughts and an action plan to make this happen, and there are 5 steps that I hope you all, as you work on your part of it, will be thinking about. The hardest part, we think, is the operational systems. The data are getting better and better, and it's just a matter of time. We're learning how to curate data, how to look across different types of data to look for consistencies and inconsistencies, but still the hardest part is to get clinicians time out of their busy days to talk to patients about participating and getting consent. And contracting, we're continuing to see, and I heard an earful from Rachel about this, contracting is just a huge problem. And whether we're talking about big data or early feasibility studies with devices, it's an issue that we need to solve together. The second is this framework for privacy, confidentiality, and security. And if you haven't looked at it, I'd urge you to go to the website from the Precision Medicine Initiative. The White House, the Office of Civil Rights, has worked in a very detailed way for a framework which I'm pretty excited about. I think it gives us the approach that we need. The third part is the data. It's what most people want to talk about, and I won't go into detail here, but I think we are learning how to iteratively make data better and better to answer questions. Fourth part is that we need new methods, and for years I've hated these meetings where you go and talk about observational treatment comparisons, and then you say, okay, are you willing to base a decision on observational treatment comparisons in situation X? And there's a lot of squirming that goes on, and and everybody says in some cases yes, some cases no, but often there's significant disagreement. So we need to keep working on the methods as we do this so that we can have confidence in the results when they come out. And then we've got to have a mind all along to streamline, because in the science world that we're evolving into, the number of questions is going to grow at an exponential rate. And we can't have the questions growing like this while our capacity to answer the questions stays flat. And I hope you'd agree with me that the solution is not to say, well, we just can't answer the question, so let's make our best guess and go forward. When you look at the power of the technologies now being developed, you don't want to be wrong about something like gene editing, because you may not be able to take it back. This is just a look. This surprised me. We've been building use cases for a national system, and it ranges all the way from more efficient clinical trials to detecting outbreaks of infectious diseases earlier, to calculating the value of therapies for CMS. And in this sort of consumer reports framework, we're a lot further along than I thought we were. So I think we're getting near a tipping point where, as we bring this together, we really will have a national system. And this is just a look to show you that these are not hypothetical situations. They're all in play, and they're all working. So last slide. Imagine if we did have the evidence generation system that I've described. Much more of clinical practice would be guided by high-quality evidence, so people would have more assurance that what they were getting was good for them. Clinicians and practice organizations could focus on interpreting the evidence and applying it instead of guessing. And the role of opinion and expertise would change from the doctor's best guess to here's the best treatment for you, depending on your preferences. Let's figure out how to do it in the most effective way. So I hope that's given you sort of an oversight of what we're thinking, and I know a lot of the rest of your day is going to be spent on how you do it with devices.